Hey guys, welcome back to the studio once again. In last week's episode, we went over the diatonic arpeggios of the major scale and a variety of ways that I like to organize and practice them on the guitar. Today, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this topic and discover how we can use a concept called pivoting to break out of potentially old habits and craft more interesting and natural sounding bebop lines. You guys ready? Let's get started. The concept of a pivot arpeggio in jazz is actually pretty simple. When we play a 7th chord arpeggio, the last note of that tertiary stack isn't super resolved sounding. Since our goal as improvisers isn't just to spell the chord and then move on, but rather to create a sense of motion through the changes, we can pivot and resolve this discordant note down the scale by one step. This has the effect of making us land on a much more consonant-sounding pitch, and as a result, makes the arpeggio feel less like a note-for-note spelling of the chord and more like a fragment of a melodic idea. The first thing we should do when learning to utilize this concept is to play the pivot arpeggio off of each note in the scale. Here, check out what that sounds like. We can get some different motion by displacing the third of each chord down an octave and then continuing to ascend from there. I really love the way this sounds, and it gives us a lot more variety by only making this one simple change to the concept. Here's an example of how that would sound. A third option is to invert the arpeggio and instead displace the arrival of the pivot point by an octave. Check out how that sounds. The last option I'm going to show you guys like this is to apply some octave displacement to our now inverted pivot. Here, check out what that sounds like. Once we get the basic concept of the pivot under our fingers, I would encourage you to practice these with the same rigor we gave to the arpeggio shapes in last video. That is to say, you should practice them on each string set and then practice them in a single position. Now, the concept really works best inside of one octave, so don't go breaking out into a flop sweat just yet. There are a ton of other ways that we can make use of this concept, but for today's purposes, we're just going to stick with these 4. In the next section, I'm going to show you guys how we can use the pivots and combine them with some simple rules for adding half steps to our scales. And that's going to turn these pivot arpeggios into more fully fleshed out bebop lines that'll work over a multitude of common chord changes. If you've watched episode 2 of my Improvised Like a Pro series, where I covered half-step rules for descending dominant scales, then this next bit of information is going to feel a little familiar to you. In case you haven't checked that one out, which, by the way, I highly recommend that you do, I'll give you the broad strokes of the idea here anyway. Basically, we need chord tones to land on the downbeats in order for our lines to sound like they land correctly. To make this happen, we sometimes need to add a half step, or 2, sometimes even 3, to our scales. Now, we can apply this sort of rule in any way that we choose, and the half step can actually be any note that normally lands on the beat when we play the scale. For example, say if I take a C major scale and I play it descending as eighth notes like this. When I do that, the root, the 6th, the 4th, and the 2nd all land on the beat. We can use those notes as half steps in situations where there actually isn't a half step possible between 2 notes. If I wanted to put a half step between the root and the 7th in the major scale, I can't, because B and C are already a half step apart. So in this case, I'm going to play D to take up the space like this, and then continue the scale run down to C. That'll sound like this. When I do that, you'll see that the chord tones of C all land on the beat. Now, there's lots of ways to do this, and I'll definitely be covering the concept in greater detail in a future video, so stay tuned. I can hear some of you groaning now. But David, I thought this video was going to be about arpeggios, and you're here talking about all this scale stuff. Yeah, I know it seems like a little bit of a tangent, but stick with me here, I promise. If I make a rule like this, play up the chord, in other words, play the arpeggio, pivot, and then come down the scale using 2 half steps between the 1 and the 7 and the 7 and the 6, I can then take that rule through the whole key, and you'll see that we get some really interesting sounding stuff happen. Take a look at what that sounds like. The chords that I decided to apply to these moments aren't the only option, by the way. There's actually a multitude of possible harmonies that we could choose to apply to each of these little melodic fragments we just played through. I would really encourage you to look carefully at all of them and use your ears as well as the theory to help you discover some other possibilities of where these moves might be resolving to. Now, let's drill down one level deeper and apply these concepts to a 2-5-1 in the key of C major and see what kind of melodic ideas we can come up with. Generally, I want to start my pivot or scale run off one of the 4 primary chord tones. That's 1, 3, 5, or 7. And then resolve my phrase on the downbeat of the C major bar. Here's 5 example licks that I cooked up for you guys to check out using all the stuff that we just went over. I hope you guys are starting to see the bigger picture here when I say that learning all this technical stuff is really just about access to the harmony. Our whole pursuit as improvisers is really to play beautiful melodies on these chord changes, and all this stuff is just an effort to help us hear those possibilities that exist in the harmony. These concepts are going to help you get through those tough moments and give you things to chew on in the practice room, but at the end of the day, we're ultimately trying to open up our ears to a new way of getting through the changes, not just our hands. Have you guys ever practiced pivoting like this? Maybe there's a lick that you transcribed a while ago that now makes more sense in this context. Leave a comment and let me know about it. I really love it when you guys get in touch and let me know how you're getting on with this stuff. There's lots more to come, so keep an eye on this space for more content like this. Thanks to my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their continued support. Those lovely people are PH, Trent Taylor, and Cedric. We also have some new additions to the studio this week. Thank you to Damon, Josh, and Paulette Christopher for your pledges. An extra special thanks goes out to Jazz Luminaire patron Bebop Babdi. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart for your support. You guys allow me to devote that much more time to making this the best jazz education content possible. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, a thank you is owed to you as well. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit that bell for notifications. I can't believe how much this little community has grown in just a couple of months' time. You guys are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.